All right, we're kicking things off with our good friend Vicki McKenna for CultureCast. Vicki, so good to see you.
Great to see you.
Well, this next story that we're going to talk about kind of tickles me a little bit. I've been a 30-year university professor, and I cannot tell you how nauseating it is to be around actual liberal academics. The smug, the intolerance, the hypocrisy, the idea that they're the most tolerant people in the room while they're shutting down and canceling everybody who disagrees. Absolutely. And now we have evidence. Take a look at this wonderful exchange between Josh Hawley and a professor, an overheated professor who I wonder where she got her PhD from. Take a look at this.
Professor Bridges, you said several times, you've used a phrase, I want to make sure I understand what you mean by it. You've referred to people with a capacity for pregnancy. Would that be women?
Many women, cis women, have the capacity for pregnancy. Many cis women do not have the capacity for pregnancy. There are also trans men who are capable of pregnancy, as well as non-binary people who are capable of pregnancy.
So this isn't really a women's rights issue.
We can recognize that this impacts women while also recognizing that it impacts other groups. Those things are not mutually exclusive, Senator Hawley.
Oh, so your view is that the core of this right then is about what?
So I want to recognize that your line of questioning is transphobic, and it opens up trans people to violence by not recognizing that.
Wow, you're saying that I'm opening up people to violence by asking whether or not women are the folks who can have pregnancies?
So I want to note that 1 out of 5 transgender persons have attempted suicide. So I think it's important
because of my line of questioning? So we can't talk about it?
Because denying that trans people exist and pretending not to know that they exist
I'm denying that trans people exist by asking you if you're talking about women having pregnancies?
Do you believe that men can get pregnant?
No, I don't think women can get
So
pregnant.
you are denying that trans people exist?
And that leads to violence? Is this how you run your classroom? Are students allowed to question you?
Absolutely.
Or are they also treated like this, where
No,
they're told that they're opening up people to violence?
We have a good time in my class. You should join.
I bet.
You might learn a lot.
Vicki, are you?
It's hard to even know where to begin on this. First, she actually stated that women and then other groups, but those other groups she was defining as women. So the first thing she did was manage to tie herself into a knot by claiming that women can get pregnant, but then other groups can as well. But she had just said previously that those other groups were in fact women. So and then finally just cop to it. You don't think men can get pregnant? Senator Hawley says, no, of course I don't think that men can get pregnant. And then of course it was proof positive that he's a transphobic person who's trying to erase the existence of trans people and wants to visit violence on them. I mean, raise your hand if that makes sense. The only people that make sense to, and they don't really think it makes sense, are the people like Kiara Bridges, who have lived their entire lives in activism or academia. But to 99% of the rest of the nation, that was just nonsense. And you know what? You're paying $50,000 a year or more now to expose your children to that nonsense. Because my guess is, and do correct me if I'm wrong, she's more common than uncommon on college campuses.
She is the prototype, archetypal professor now these days. It's amazing, too, that these professors have no core knowledge. These aren't historians, they're not philosophers, they're not literature professors, they're not sociologists, they're literally just race-baiting activists. And that's all it takes. It's all it takes to become a professor these days, is the right, anguished, tortured view of culture. And let me throw this out real quickly while we're at this. Notice what she also said, too. The idea that if you disbelieve so that trans people can be whatever they want to be, that makes you a bigot. So there's a long list of things.
It makes you a violent bigot who wants trans people to die.
Can trans men menstruate? Of course, you got to answer. It's a socialist checklist of alternative truths, right? Whatever the party, in this case the progressives, whatever they say, that's the truth.
Yeah, and notice that she wasn't even bothered by the fact that she had actually contradicted herself, or bothered by the fact that what she was saying was just pure nonsense in a complete, disregard of actual reality. Reality, the irreality, surreality that we are supposed to accept. We are supposed to accept, or we're criminals of some kind, or we're so fundamentally immoral we ought to be criminals of some kind. I mean, that's where they've got you. They've got you in a place where you can never argue because they don't want to argue, because is they can't actually present an argument or anything that looks like a debate for their position. So they insist that their reality is one that you have to acquiesce to. And if you don't, you're a bad person. And you're a bad person in some cases that ought to be considered criminally bad. So, I mean, this is how they confound and confuse people, is just by simply, deciding that a fantasy is reality and then forcing you to accept their fantasy every step of the way as it changes on the fly even.
Yeah, as a professor, I can underscore what you just wrote. It's not the quality of your argument. It's not the evidence and the empirical truth that you present to these people. It's the mere fact that you're arguing with them that makes you a bigot. It doesn't
exactly
matter.
True.
It doesn't, yeah.
And look what Hawley did. He was very gentle. He was polite. He was waiting for her to try to explain herself. But she just simply kept changing the topic ever so slightly. So he's asking whether or not men can get pregnant. He's asking, what is this idea of people with the capacity for pregnancy? Are you talking about women? She immediately shifts to accusing him of wanting trans people to commit suicide or visiting violence on trans people. And then he tries to bring her back to the original point, and she continues to try to move to slightly shift reality just enough so that she never actually has to answer a question.
After the break, I want to take this conversation a little bit further, because there are other aspects of what our good professor said that really need to be challenged. We'll see you on the other side. Back again with Vicki McKenna for the second part of our conversation. The other thing, Vicki, before we let this go, and I think this absolutely has to be pointed out, because people are terrified of making the point I'm about to make. She said that you denied trans rights by asking if women are the only ones who can get pregnant. So we already handled that in the first part of the first segment. However, she then turned around and she said, "This is why trans people are killing themselves. I want to challenge that." How do you know that, Professor? How do you know that? Because trans people are continuing to kill themselves over the fact that we have over-recognized them now. We have given them so much recognition, so many rights, so many opportunities.
In 5 years, by the way.
In 5
rapid
years.
Fashion.
And they're still killing themselves. I would have loved to have been sitting where Hawley was and said to her, "You know what? How do you know these people are mentally ill and not trans suffering?" It seems to me that we're so much more understanding than we have ever been, and yet the suicides continue. But the idea,
isn't it weird? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
Isn't it weird? You've got now affirmation is the demand, that instead of saying this is something called gender dysphoria, this is just your identity. And by the way, your identity at age 3 or age 5, you're not supposed to do anything except affirm, affirm, affirm. That's what the left is saying. Affirm whatever reconstruction of reality somebody decides to create because they're trying to hide from something, some kind of mental pain, some kind of trauma. Don't address trauma. Why would we address trauma? Trauma has nothing to do with people, picking up rifles and murdering children in classrooms. That has nothing to do with trauma, right? So let's never address the trauma and just affirm, 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 affirm. And so yes, you have an alarmingly high number of people who have declared themselves trans committing suicide. But instead of actually trying to figure out where that trauma is coming from, instantly the left automatically blames a lack of people who want to practice the affirmation and accept the altered reality. I haven't seen a trans person run into a trans person, had a conversation with a trans person in 10 years, but somehow I'm responsible for mentally distressed people killing themselves, even though the entire culture has now been forced to bend one knee and acquiesce to a reality that does not exist, just to make mentally traumatized people feel better, and it doesn't appear to be doing any good.
And you think about this too. We understand that homosexuals in this culture do have a slightly higher suicide rate than non-heterosexuals. But however, than heterosexuals. And however, Can you imagine how illogically and stupid it would sound if people made the argument gay people are killing themselves because we haven't recognized homosexuality? Even that wouldn't be able to fly on the left. But when it comes to this, it seems to me that the smaller and the more inconsequential the minority group, the more the left has to elevate them to the biggest victims in the history of the world.
Yeah, so tell me why the entire culture has caved to this. This is something that I've been trying to figure out. Maybe 7 years ago when it first started to become a thing, trans started to become a thing during the Obama administration. And I said, this isn't going to work. And here's why it isn't going to work. Because women are not going to give up their locker rooms and their bathrooms. And men are not going to allow their daughters to be exposed to creepy men who wanted to declare themselves as women. I said openly 7 years ago, there's no way. And 9 months later, I had to eat my words because already the culture had started to fall. Already the dominoes had been tipped over and nobody was fighting back. Not dads, not parents. We've got a little bit of pushback at the school level at this point. But honestly, it's just stunning to me that it seems that everybody was, you're afraid? You're afraid of the purple-haired obese woman with the nose ring and the ear gauges and the neck tattoo who's telling you she's a man? You're afraid of her? What are you afraid of? That you might have to stare at those hideous features for a little bit longer? I mean, why are we so scared of people who honestly are dancing around demanding that we actually pretend like we're all stoned to accept their reality?
Yeah, in the first segment, you made the observation that 99% of people don't see the world the way this professor did. However, when you look at kids who are in the public school system right now, from 5 all the way through the graduation of high school seniors, you know what? That number is a lot lower than 99% because of the constant, relentless trans bullying that's taking place in the schools.
Yeah, and it works.
It works.
And it works because we've got kids that are, just because a girl is a tomboy, she's being told by counselors and she's being told by advisors or teachers that she's trans. And then there are groups out there that are looking to isolate kids like that and convince them that the source of their problems is that they're just simply the alternate gender. And then of course the policy is to affirm without even having the parents looped into any of the decision making or any of the exposure that the child is going to be experiencing. So yeah, I mean, you're right. When you indoctrinate someone, I mean, notice how it's worked across entire countries and cultures in the past to create totalitarian societies. This is essentially a sort of a microcosm of what we've seen happen on a much broader and more deadly scale. And it's just a matter of time, I think, before the next issue gets wrapped in. What's the next issue going to be? Right now it's trans. Pretty soon that's going to become boring. We're going to need something new.